95% of the war games that they took part in ended up in some sort of nuclear strike. When one party within those two, so these are all AI models talking at each other, used a nuclear weapon, which traditionally would have been kind of the big thing that would stop any sort of escalation, actually it only de-escalated 14% of the time. And even more concerningly, actually, these AIs do make mistakes. 86% of the time they ended up pressing the button incorrectly or overstepping the rules that they had set out for themselves in the first place.
It's time for a deadly game.
Let's play Global Thermonuclear War. Fine. All right.
The film War Games, of course, while reality is catching up with the 1980s sci-fi. Researchers have found that popular AI models never back down and almost always use nuclear weapons when they play simulated war games. All this as the Pentagon pushes for deeper integration of AI in the military. It's believed AI, artificial intelligence, was used in the operation to capture Nicolas Maduro. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, let's bring in tech journalist Chris Stokel-Walker. Good morning.
Good morning, Kate.
First off, can you explain this idea that AI models turn to nuclear weapons when they're simulating a war game?
Yeah, so effectively we know that lots of military officials, wargaming happens all the time within countries, and this was an attempt to try and simulate that using 3 different AI models, some of the most popular ones that are used by us every single day. So basically they went through around about 21 different series of games, asking them how they would each react to the others' responses if they were in a sort of simulated situation where they felt like they had to get into a war game situation with another country. Overall, around about 780 odd thousand words of strategic reasoning. That's kind of a combination of War and Peace and the Iliad combined. And it turns out that an awful lot of the time they like to press the big red button. So a cheery little note for us on a Thursday morning.
And Chris, this might sound a bit meta, but is that because the AI knows it's only a simulation? Is there any way of knowing whether if the AI thought it was in a real world scenario, it would make a different choice?
Yeah, this is the difficult thing to unpick from this paper, which was not really clear about this. There are some indications that AI models do know when they are being tested, and they then either try and play a little bit with the person that is testing them, or they actually improve their performance and then kind of slump down in the same way that we might put on a good performance when we know we're being watched and actually away from the cameras. We tend to retreat a little bit into our own selves. But actually, I think regardless of that, the concern is more probably that they were acting like this because of what they've been trained on, which is stuff like you have just played at the start of the segment here, of actually there are these sci-fi films, there are these kind of very dystopian novels on which AI models are trained because they just hoover up everything on the web. And it turns out that they actually think that that is how we humans behave.
But they also, Chris, would have been trained on the implications and the fallout, literally, of nuclear war. They would have had all of the films that dealt with that side of things too. Are they making this choice? Can we determine whether they're making that choice because a nuclear weapon is the most effective weapon in a war scenario? Or are they making it because they are sort of modelling the films, as you say?
It's difficult to discern that, to be completely honest, Kate. I think that it probably is a little bit of both. I think regardless of whether or not they're just following what the films say or whether or not they're actually making real decisions that they would in this sort of situation, the increasing layering of AI into military action is a little bit of a concern, particularly here when you look at some of the stats. So 95% of the war games that they took part in ended up in some sort of nuclear strike. When one party within those two, so these are all AI models talking at each other, used a nuclear weapon, which traditionally would have been kind of the big thing that would stop any sort of escalation. Actually, it only de-escalated 14% of the time. And even more concerningly, actually, these AIs do make mistakes. 86% of the time they ended up pressing the button incorrectly or overstepping the rules that they had set out for themselves in the first place.
So therefore, we know that AI is already being used in these contexts. We don't really know what kinds of things it's being trained on or the way it's being used. Would you be concerned to think of these types of models, and obviously there are lots of different types of AI, but these specific types of models being introduced into military systems at the moment?
Without human oversight, absolutely. And, I'm just a journalist translating what other people say. And, I spoke to several experts, both in military spheres and also in terms of in this sort of nuclear research sphere. I think probably one person said it best of all, which was a researcher at the University of Aberdeen called James Johnson, who I spoke to. He said, from a nuclear risk perspective, the findings are unsettling.
Well, I think that's putting it mildly, Chris. Thank you so much for taking us through that, just kind of very calmly and in a very measured manner. I know lots of people listening to that will not feel particularly calm about it, but great to have you with us. Thanks, Chris Stokel-Walker.
What I find, I hadn't really thought this through properly, but if you can't use fiction as a basis for determining real-world action, because the Terminator film, for example, or War Games, or various dystopias, Brave New World, 1984, they're figments of imagination, but that's incredible that could be used to channel decision making in the real world.
Yeah, but remember, you can define the terms of what an AI would rely on and work with. I mean, some of these huge large language models, I mean, they do drag in absolutely everything.
Yeah.
But you can build an AI that would be able to streamline and work out what kind of decisions you would want
Which
to make.
you'd hope the military would do.
I think that's what I was trying to get at there with Chris, in that we're not talking about asking ChatGPT whether or not to bomb Iran. It's not that kind of a thing.
I understand that.
But it's an interesting game, and also listening to Chris say that even within its own guardrails that AI sets for itself, it's actually breaking them on many occasions.
I genuinely think, I said this, you joined our prediction meeting, I was sort of saying this, and I'm being serious, it sounds like I'm being really flip. I've got a 7-year-old, my youngest. I worry that the world will have ended by the time she's 30. I think that I've never thought that at any point in my life, that I didn't grow up in the proper Cold War. I feel that that's a thing to be thought about. That the way we're using technology, the way technology is getting quicker and quicker and quicker, exponentially, its tentacles are getting everywhere. It is not impossible that the world just ends.
We've got the two perfect people to talk about this with later on. Peter Frankopan and Jenny Kleeman are going to join us from 9 to talk about all of the biggest stories of the day. We'll get into this with them and what it means for defence, for young people, for all of us, actually. We'll talk about AI later on.